Good afternoon. Welcome to Fridays at 1. I'm Leslie Herman, co-chair of the Fridays at 1 committee with Ken Whitty. Next year, I will be co-chair with Ruth Mackaman, as Ken will stay on the committee but not be the chair. Fridays at 1 is a lecture series on topics of general interest and open to the public. It's a program of the IRP, the Peer Learning Division of the New School, as most of you know because we're fellow members of the IRP. We've been around for more than 50 years, and to find out if you're new to the IRP and you're not a member, just Google newschool.edu/IRP. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Bryan Doerries. Bryan is the founder and artistic director of Theater of War. He's also the New York City Public Artist in Residence this year, and he's doing more than 60 programs in the New York City area. Theater of War has performed Greek tragedies at hundreds of military bases, prisons, hospitals, to spur conversations about trauma, violence, and survival. Bryan will talk about how the plays of Sophocles and Euripides can help individuals and communities heal from trauma and loss. I should also mention that Bryan does his own translations of these plays from the original Greek. After the talk, Bryan will take questions followed by a book signing. Please welcome me and please join me in welcoming Bryan Doerries.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you all for coming out. Fridays at 1. As was mentioned, my name is Bryan Doerries. I'm the artistic director of Theater of War Productions and currently serving as public artist in residence for New York City. Not the only one. There are a few others of us who are embedded in city government, launching sort of large-scale public art projects. Mine is 65 performances of our projects, of which there are now 22 projects that all address pressing public health and social issues through a format you're going to hear about today of live theater that's meant to catalyze really powerful discussions about sometimes very difficult and often divisive subjects. Our work takes place in New York City in places as wide-ranging as homeless shelters, housing projects, Lincoln Center, WNYC, where we have a monthly series. You can come to our next one on May 3rd at the Green Space. Community centers, Rikers Island, all kinds of places, military bases. And everywhere we go, we hear the most powerful things about the plays we perform, spoken not by educated elite, but by people who've lived the extremities of life. And one of the ideas behind our work is that a prerequisite for understanding antiquity is human experience. So if I had 2 lives to live, would that I did, I would spend the first living it to its extremes and then the second studying antiquity. And maybe that's what Fridays at 1 is about as well. It's great to meet an audience that actually has some life experience because often I find myself talking to 18 and 19-year-olds about Greek tragedy, and there you're trying to connect with things they have yet to understand. So I'm going to deliver a combination of prepared and sort of off-the-cuff remarks because in some ways this book and the work that you've heard about from Leslie is actually kind of a prequel to what we're doing now. And I've been giving the same lecture for years and would like to sort of give you a sense for how this all started and then a sense for what we're doing now. And then just open up for discussion because it's way more fertile just to sort of field questions and engage. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense for how Theater of War began and the first performance, which took place 10 years ago for 400 Marines and their spouses in San Diego. And then I'll talk a little bit about a project called Antigone in Ferguson, and I'll show a clip from one of our latest projects on police-community relations that uses Antigone as the core text. Back to my prepared remarks. My name's Bryan, and I'm a Brooklyn-based translator and director I'm the founder of Theater of War, which we define as a public health project that presents dramatic readings of ancient Greek war plays to military and civilian audiences all over the world as a catalyst for powerful and timeless discussions about the visible and the invisible wounds of war. And what this means is that over the past decade, a very small portion of your tax dollars have gone not to building remotely guided weapons systems, but to resurrecting an ancient military technology, one that was developed and refined during the 5th century BC in order to promote healing, compassion, and a sense of community. Over the past 10 years, we've presented plays by Sophocles, such as Ajax and Philoctetes, about decorated warriors struggling under the weight of their service to maintain their dignity and their honor in the face of betrayal, guilt, and grief for close to 100,000 service members, veterans, and their families at places as far-ranging as the Pentagon, homeless shelters, VA hospitals, military bases in the Middle East, Japan, Germany, and even in Cuba at Gitmo, and also unlikely places such as Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, the Guggenheim Museum, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and last night, John Jay College. So performances of ancient Greek plays for contemporary warriors of all ranks and services, from infantry grunts to sailors to drone pilots, to Navy SEALs, and most recently for the Joint Chiefs of Staff down in DC, and the top 20 four-star generals in the world are combatant commanders. So those recently was our most recent audience in the military. And everywhere we've gone, we hear the most insightful and life-changing things spoken about ancient myths by individuals who've lived lives of mythological proportions, who've faced the stakes of life and death, who've loved, who've lost, who know the meaning of sacrifice. It's our contention that these are their stories, and that the audience always knows more than we do if it's an audience with skin in the game. And that these stories don't belong just to those of us who are privileged enough to have studied them in the ivory tower, but to those with skin in the game. So I just want to take a minute to acknowledge that a majority of the time when someone mentions Greek tragedy, even to the educated, we tend to glaze over with preemptive boredom and ennui. Most of us probably developed an allergy to Greek tragedy in high school when some well-intending English instructor required us to read plays like Oedipus Rex or Antigone or Prometheus Bound or Oresteia in rigid Victorian-sounding translations, or forced us to watch seemingly endless films featuring British actors in loose sheets and golden sandals declaiming the vocative refrain, "Oh, Zeus," behind golden masks. So if you've early encounters with the ancient Greeks zapped you of any ambition to ever pick up a play by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides again, know this: you are not alone. Aeschylus is known for having written in his play The Agamemnon that humans learn through suffering, but for most students, studying ancient Greek drama is just an exercise in suffering with no apparent educational value. One hope of this brief talk is to administer an antidote to the obligatory high school unit on ancient tragedy. Now, for most of my life, I believed, as I imagine many of you do, what I learned in high school, which was that Greek tragedy is a supreme expression of pessimism by a fatalistic society that depicts a universe in which we humans barely apprehend the forces at work upon us, chance, luck, fate, gods, governments, genetics, until it's too late, usually milliseconds too late, and we've unwittingly destroyed ourselves, our loved ones, and generations to come. And while this is in fact what happens on stage in Greek tragedies, the question I sort of wrestled with early in my career was, why would a people, no matter how cynical, no matter how fatalistic, gather together, close to 1/3 of the Athenian population, for 3 consecutive days each spring in Athens on the south slope of the Acropolis to watch plays about characters with reasonably good and noble intentions, learning of their mistakes too late and then suffering wretchedly for it? What good could possibly come of such an exercise day after day, year after year, play after play, unless there was a difference between what was happening on the stage and what it evoked in the audience? So what if tragedy is a form of storytelling that was designed not to send us home to wallow in our respective misery or in the fragility or futility of human existence, but to wake us up to the slim possibility of human agency, of making a choice that averts imminent disaster, before it's too late? What if tragedy is as refined an advancement of technology as the architecture, sculpture, law, government of the 5th century BC, or our iPhones today, such technology that 2,500 years later we are just beginning to harness? A form of storytelling that arose in a militarized democracy out of necessity over nearly 80 years of war, to communalize the trauma of war and give citizens permission to access and express their emotions and help heal the city. So that's my opening spiel, and I'm just going to skip ahead to my description of the first theater of war performance, and if there's some backstory that's missing, we can fill in the gaps later, because I want to get to our discussion, and I don't want to read to you the entire time. But I do want to read to you this section because in a very condensed way, it describes the experience that I first had with a military audience. Now, as you can tell, I thought I was pretty clever for translating these plays. I thought I knew something. I studied classics. I thought I knew what they were about. But in my early 20s, I had a series of experiences that changed my orientation to Greek tragedy and also to life. I lost a number of people I loved. And going back to that notion that life experience is a prerequisite for understanding antiquity, which is something that Nietzsche argues in his work in an essay in the late 19th century called We Philologists, kind of arguing that classicists have no business talking about antiquity because they haven't lived real lives. I lost someone I loved, including my girlfriend, which I recount in my book, and experienced loss, experienced my own ambivalence in the face of human suffering. I experienced the limits of my compassion, and I experienced the moral distress of all of those things and the isolation that comes from witnessing suffering and feeling complicit in someone else's suffering. And it sent me back to the plays that I thought I knew, but all of a sudden had a new relationship with, and it was as if these ancient Greek plays all of a sudden at age 26 were written for me or about me, like letters from the ancient world. And I took solace in knowing that I wasn't the first person to have ever felt this way. It doesn't also come as a coincidence that many of these plays feature young people: Antigone, Orestes, Electra, Hylas, Neoptolemus, the list goes on, thrust into ethically impossible situations for which there are no right answers and by which they will be haunted for the rest of their lives, no matter what they decide to do. There's a theory that Greek drama was a form of storytelling that was oriented toward young people, late adolescents, in Greek called ephebes. And it's as if the Greeks were saying to them, this is what characterizes adult life. Get ready. So that's where I got the idea, after starting in hospitals up at Weill Cornell, of directing readings of these plays I'd translated, that maybe there were other populations who'd experienced loss and who'd experienced grief and who'd experienced suffering that could be helped by hearing these plays. It was around that time the Walter Reed scandal broke, and our nation's flagship military medical hospital was shown to be offering very deficient care to our veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. It seemed to me that if we had the audacity to send them to war, we should at least, no matter what our political convictions, care for them when they returned. And all I had was Greek tragedy, but I had this hunch that if I could bring Sophocles' plays to Walter Reed, something would happen. Well, I didn't know anyone in the military at the time. It took a year and a half. This was a hobby, an avocation, but I finally talked my way into having a military audience. It was a conference in San Diego for 700 Marines and their families. And I'm just going to describe that experience because it's sort of the key to unlocking everything we do and have done ever since, the 700 performances that have followed in the last 10 years. So those Marines who attended the first military reading of my translations of Sophocles' Ajax and Philoctetes in a Hyatt ballroom in San Diego came of their own volition. They'd freely chosen ancient Greek dinner theater over free tickets to a San Diego's Padres game, and many of them had brought their spouses to the performance. The bar and the buffet in the back of the cavernous room certainly helped to draw the crowd, as did the presence of several well-known actors, David Strathairn, Jesse Eisenberg, Bill Camp, and Heather Raffo, but no one who showed up that night had any idea about what was going to happen, least of all did I. A large number of Marines probably expected to see a fully staged reenactment of the 300 Spartans bravely standing down the Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae, featuring hack and slash sword play and pyrotechnics. And when they discovered 4 actors sitting at a table in their street clothes with scripts instead of battle axes or spears, a sizable portion of the audience was visibly disappointed. But 20 minutes into the performance, as Bill Camp, the fierce New York actor playing Ajax, wailed and screamed about how he wished to kill Odysseus, and finally resolved that a great man must live in honor or die an honorable death before plunging himself upon the enemy's sword, something the audience seemed to shift. All the cell phones disappeared. Everyone in the room leaned forward and locked on, a military term that describes when service members stare intensely at something or someone with a preternaturally long period of time. Some of the Marines rested their heads in their hands, peering through cracks in their fingers. Others gazed off in the distance, glazed over, but fully listening with every fiber of their beings. A few wiped tears from their eyes, tightly gripping spouses' hands, while others smirked at certain words with recognition. It was as if these ancient plays had found their intended audience 2,500 years later after they'd first been performed. Before the performance began that night in San Diego, while scanning the crowd congregating in the Hyatt Ballroom with its harsh fluorescent lighting and wall-to-wall carpeting, I saw young Marines gravitating toward the back of the ballroom and older, more seasoned ones congregating close to the front. Though there were women in attendance that night, the majority of audience members were male, and that shouldn't come as a surprise since the core is roughly 94% male. Finally, I saw a cluster of middle-aged women in relatively formal attire move with near-perfect posture down the middle aisle, single file, and sit ceremoniously in the front row just before what looked to be self-made paper nameplates. One of the women caught my eye. I made a beeline for where I was standing at the makeshift stage, a raised platform at the base of the ballroom. She reached up and took my hand, excuse me, my bottle got slammed there. She reached up and took my hand and looked deeply into my eyes and said with an unsettling blend of formality and familiarity, "Hi, Brian, I'm Bonnie." And I soon learned Bonnie was the wife of the second most powerful general in the Marine Corps, the assistant commandant. "It's lovely to meet you, Bonnie," I replied. "We're thrilled to be here." And I quickly introduced her to the actors, and who each nodded respectfully in her direction. And after an appropriate amount of time had passed, I attempted to retrieve my hand from Bonnie's. But she grasped it tightly, leaned in closer, and said with suspicion and conviction, "I know you are here to perform an act of love." She continued to hold my hand as well as my gaze, as if to leave no doubt in my mind as to the subtext of her statement. "You had better be here to perform an act of love." "We are," I said with confidence. Then, fearing she was far from convinced, I repeated myself and smiled. "We are." And she slowly released my hand from her power grip and returned to her seat in the front row, flanked on either side by what I now knew were the general's wives, the high priestesses of the Hyatt Regency. I have since learned that the wives of Marine Corps generals hold a special place of prominence in their communities, one that affords them power and stature that is not always extended to the spouses of generals and other services. It should also be mentioned that it's widely held that the only women that would have been in the audience in the 5th century BC were the high priestesses, so hence my reference to the high priestesses of the Hyatt Regency. Then the performance began. Vocal cords were shedded, spit flew, and for budgetary reasons, I'm going to give you some of this material in more dramatic form. And the actors fully committed themselves to the extreme emotions and anguish in Sophocles' words. Women throughout the room wiped their tears from their faces as Ajax's wife, Tecmessa, put words to their worst fears. "How can I say something that should never be spoken? You would rather die than hear what I'm about to say. Divine madness poisoned his mind, tainting his name during the night. Our home is a slaughterhouse, littered with cow carcasses and goats, gushing thick blood, throats slit horn to horn by his hand, evil omens of things to come." Marines shifted in their seat with discomfort as Ajax called out for the deaths, not just of the generals who betrayed them, but of every warrior in the Greek army. "I call upon the Furies, those long-striding, dread maidens who avenge humans and see to their endless suffering. Witness how the generals have destroyed me. Train your eyes on those evil men, snatch them with your talons, and just as I die at my own hands, may they also be murdered by their own flesh and blood. It's feeding time. Gorge yourselves upon the generals and their men. Fiercely descend upon the army. Devour it whole. Spare no soldier." And minutes later, many audience members covered their ears as the warrior Philoctetes wailed in agony as the mysterious disease ravaged his broken body, calling out for death to visit him and release him from pain. I have a sinking feeling your prayer will not be honored by the gods, for as we speak, blood is oozing from the sore, a dark red sign of evil things to come. The pain swells underneath my foot. I feel it moving upward, tightening in my chest. I am wretched. Please don't go. You understand. You know. Stay with me. I wish they could feel this. Odysseus and the generals. Death. 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 Where are you? Why, after all these years of calling, have you not appeared? So when the performance ended, it was followed by a long, powerful silence, and then overwhelming applause, a standing ovation that lasted minutes. The plays had clearly struck a nerve, but it was unclear what would happen next. To help break the ice of the post-reading discussion, I had worked with the conference planners to identify a few members of the audience, the community, to respond to the play in the moment from their guts and talk about what they heard and saw that resonated with their experiences at war and caring for those who'd been to war. One of the panelists was a beautifully kept, perfectly appointed woman in her mid-40s with blonde hair and striking blue eyes and an unassuming voice. And she leaned into her table mic, looked out in the audience, and said, "Hello, my name is Marshall Waddell. I'm the proud mother of a Marine. I'm the wife of a Navy SEAL, and my husband went away 4 times to war, and each time he returned just like Ajax, dragging invisible bodies into our house. And to quote from the play, our home is a slaughterhouse." The Marines all held their breath. In the back, a small group congregated around a cash bar, nursing Budweisers, gazing at the floor, waiting out the silence. Marshall continued with her emotionally charged remarks. She quoted lines spoken by Tecmessa, the wife of this great warrior who in the 9th year loses his best friend in combat. And then when he's passed over for the award of his armor, Achilles' armor, he tries to kill his commanding officers, and then ultimately, after failing to do so and killing animals, instead he takes his own life. "How can I say something that should never be spoken?" she quoted. "You would rather die than hear what I'm about to say." And after the panelists had, and for a moment from the body language in the room, it seemed like Marshall might be right. She was speaking the truth of her experiences as a caregiver, as a military spouse, and as painful as it was to say and hear, she was also opening a space for other spouses in the room to speak their personal truths. After the panelists had finished their brief opening remarks and had received strong supportive applause, I thanked them for their candor and bravery and turned to face the audience. "Now's the time," I said, "when we'd like to hear from you. Were there lines of dialogue or moments that resonated with your experiences?" I gestured toward the microphones on stands that we had placed in front row near the center aisle and waited to see if anyone who would be willing to stand up and speak. Now, I should mention at this moment in 2008, it was seen as a career-ending gesture to raise your hand and say, "I'm struggling with an invisible wound," or "My husband has PTSD," or any of the things, or "My spouse." So the stakes were high. And after a long, awkward silence, much to my disappointment, a few people stood up and offered predictable, rote statements about how we should support our veterans and place our faith in God. And this was followed by a heavier, even more interminable silence. And then finally, a short nun, who I later learned was a chaplain in the Canadian Army, approached the microphone with a small piece of paper in her hands, and she adjusted the microphone and, stretching it down toward her face, stood there silently for several seconds, pregnant with speech, and clearly debating whether to say what was on her mind, and then before lifting up her head to utter the following words while reading very carefully and deliberately from her notes. "I'd like to repeat a line from the play Ajax that I've heard countless young men say to me over decades of serving alongside them in multiple wars. Witness how the generals have destroyed me." Bonnie, the assistant commandant's wife, shot up in the front row, not even bothering to approach the mic, and shouted something to the effect of, "How dare you say that? Our husbands made this conference possible. This is about healing, not assigning blame." The crowd recoiled at the unfolding conflict between the nun and the general's wife, and just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Marshall jumped into the fray and spoke directly to Bonnie, who was still fuming in the front of the ballroom. I can definitely relate to that line. Over the years, my husband has said things like that to me too. He's felt that way on many occasions. And at this point, the tension in the room had risen to such a boil that I started scanning for the nearest exit in case, in the heat of the argument that seemed likely to escalate, we needed to make a quick getaway. At this point, and Marcel's remark prompted a second general's wife to stand up and go on the attack, accusing the nun of purposely undermining her husband's authority. Marcel responded calmly, without sounding the least bit defensive. I did not mean to say anything disrespectful about your husband, ma'am. I'm simply repeating something that my husband, who was a Navy SEAL, not a Marine, has said in the past. Before I knew it, there were at least 30 people lined up to speak at the microphones, and each person, whether or not he or she responded directly to the nun or the general's wives or Marcel, as leadership was one of the only many themes that emerged during the discussion, quoted lines from Ajax and Philoctetes without consulting notes, as if they had known these plays their entire lives. And of course they had, because these were their stories. And they interweaved their comments about the plays with their own experiences with such prosody and such rhetoric, it seemed like Sophocles himself had written their monologues. The event reached its dramatic climax when a charismatic African-American sergeant major named Ronald Green stood up and began to deliver at full tilt a sermon about the price of leadership, aiming his words in the direction of generals' wives in the front row. And as he spoke, a large portion of the diverse audience began calling and responding to him as if in a prayer meeting. To be a leader means that 99% of the time you try to do the right thing, but it doesn't mean just because you're a leader that you always end up doing the right thing. You say it, brother. To be a leader means that your decisions are going to cost lives, and so even if you do the right thing, there are families of Marines you will have lost in battle who will never think that you did the right thing no matter what you say. Amen. The sergeant major had emerged as the kind of chorus leader, bridging the world of the play with the world of the audience. At times, it wasn't clear whether he was quoting from the play or speaking extemporaneously, so impassioned and dramatically compelling was his speech. He was taking a huge risk speaking publicly to the generals' wives in this manner, but his delivery was so eloquent and powerful that he rallied the rest of the audience to stand behind him and chant their support in unison. I later learned the Sergeant Major received a phone call from Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico later that night inquiring about what he had said, but in the end he wasn't disciplined. In fact, he went on to become the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps, so the highest ranking NCO. We had scheduled 45 minutes for an audience discussion following the plays. The discussion continued well into the night, and after lasting more than 3.5 hours, it had to be cut off at midnight, but it clearly could have lasted until dawn. The next morning, as the actors and I were preparing to leave the hotel for the airport, there was an AP reporter there who had been assigned to cover the event. The Marine Corps, as opposed to the rest of the services, invites press to everything. They don't care if it's even bad press as long as people are talking about the Marine Corps. That's as opposed to the rest. They call it the Department of Defense for a very clear reason. But they had let the AP, LA Times, the BBC, the LA Weekly in, and the next day 200 newspapers picked up the story of the first performance. This AP reporter walked over to me and said with sly amusement, you do realize that there were 3 generals sitting in the back row last night? And I stopped in my tracks, wide-eyed with the revelation that everyone else in the audience had been aware of this, and that the discussion had been conducted in such a way that no one had addressed the generals directly. The closest they had come had been through their wives. And everyone had been speaking, though, to the generals and to each other in this highly coded manner, which I could barely apprehend as a civilian. It was then that I began to think of the audience as the translator and not me. Standing in the Hyatt lobby, I realized something about the power of ancient Greek drama, both in the ancient world and now today, that I could not have known until I heard 400 Marines and their spouses responding to Sophocles' words. Thanks to the U.S. Marine Corps, we'd peered into the ancient past and come into contact with an aspect of performance that I firmly believe must have been taking place within the confines of the theater of Dionysus during the 5th century BC. And I saw firsthand how these ancient plays possessed the power to disrupt rigid hierarchies, at least temporarily, and to give warriors of all ranks permission to bear witness to the truth of the experience of war. Tragedy, it seemed, from the audience's response in San Diego, was not simply entertainment. In the right audience, Sophocles' plays did what they had been designed to do. So that's the description of the first performance of Theater of War, and just briefly, within about 4 or 5 months of that first performance, I found myself in the office near the Pentagon of a 1-star general who was saying things to me like, we need to do your project in football stadiums for 30 to 40,000 soldiers at a time. And I had to convince her that that was not the scale of intimate discussion that we needed. But she also convinced me that that was the scale of the problem that they face. Time is not our friend, she kept saying. Never has so great a burden been placed on the shoulders of so few on behalf of so many for so long, she repeated. And so we then embarked on the largest collaboration or partnership between artists and the Department of Defense in American history. And we did 100 performances in that first year alone on military bases all over the world. And the experience changed my life, changed my understanding of Greek drama, reoriented my sense of what theater was and its relationship to audience, and paved the way for the work that we're doing now. After an early performance of Theater of War, I always ask the same question of audiences with Theater of War. Why do you think Sophocles wrote this play? What was he trying to say? What was his objective in front of 17,000 citizen soldiers in a century in which they saw nearly 80 years of war? What are these plays about war really designed to do? And we were on a military base in Germany in our first year, and this young man who was 19 years old shot back to me without even taking the microphone, "I think Sophocles wrote the play to boost morale." And I said, "Well, what's morale boosting about watching a great warrior lose his best friend and then come unglued and try to kill him?" And before I could finish asking the question, the young man shot back, "Because it's the truth." And then he said, "And we're all sitting here shoulder to shoulder acknowledging it." And then he said, "It's not being whitewashed." Now, for me, that changed my entire relationship to tragedy in a whole different way. That 19-year-old showed me what is a sort of article of faith of our work night after night, day after day, that instead of sending us home to wallow in our misery, that coming together as a community to face the darkest aspects of what it means to be human in a room, in a space together, could bring camaraderie, could bring joy, could reduce our sense of isolation, could increase our sense of belonging and interconnection across very disparate human experiences. So that article of faith is what led us to some of the work we've been doing. And in the early days, I went searching for audiences, and then audiences started searching for us. And first, we were in prisons, and then we were in end-of-life care and palliative care and hospice. And then all of a sudden, there was a tornado in Joplin, Missouri, and someone wrote and said, "Do you have a play that can help this community after a year when the FEMA trucks are rolling out of town in Joplin, move forward with a conversation about what they've lost, but also what they've gained?" And we did the Book of Job, which actually I think I talked about in this very lecture hall a couple years ago. We did the Book of Job in Joplin, Missouri, in a mega church for 2,200 fundamentalist Christians with Paul Giamatti as Job and David Strathairn as God. And that led to other performances. Disasters led to addiction, and the NIH commissioned us to start performing Long Day's Journey into Night, Act 3, for doctors to confront them with their prejudices against patients who were struggling with addiction. And that led to all kinds of things. And then recently, in recent years, about 2 years ago, we were approached about the killing of Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American youth in Ferguson, Missouri. And rather than give you my spiel with just the remaining minutes before I take Q&A, I'm just going to play you a clip from the PBS NewsHour coverage of that performance, just so you get a sense for the scale of what we do. Briefly, we decided this moved our model into a new place. This is why Theater of War is a prequel for what we're doing now. We decided we don't compromise on the actors we use. We use the best actors in the universe. We have 200 actors, many of the best actors who've ever walked the planet. But we decided we were going to engage with the sort of natural resource of St. Louis that would be at the same level as our actors. So we decided to engage with gospel music. And we built a gospel choir that was half police officers and half Black Lives Matter activists and members of the faith community, and 3 of Michael Brown's teachers are in it. And we premiered this project on the stage where Michael Brown graduated at Ferguson, Missouri. And I'm just going to play a little bit, if I can get this going again, full screen.
It has been, as we've been discussing, a difficult week in Charlotte where police and residents have clashed over the shooting death of a Black man. It comes the same week that an officer was charged with manslaughter, as we've also been discussing, over that shooting in Tulsa. But even amid the protests and tensions around the country, an unusual theater project is trying to help a community move forward. Jeffrey Brown went to Ferguson, Missouri to see the efforts to heal.
Were you aware of my proclamation forbidding the body to be buried?
Yes, I knew it was a crime.
And you still dared to break the law?
I didn't know your laws were more powerful than divine laws, Creon.
In ancient Thebes, a clash between the state's need for security and order and the conscience of an individual, as a dead body lies on the ground unburied. But we are in modern-day Missouri, near Ferguson, where 2 years ago, 18-year-old Michael Brown's body lay in the street for 4 hours after he was shot and killed by a police officer, leading to violent clashes and days of protest and rioting. A grand jury cleared Officer Darren Wilson of criminal wrongdoing, but the U.S. Justice Department found a pattern of racial bias in a predominantly white police force in a predominantly black city.
You talk about the racial disparity and all of that. It was just a pot that was waiting to boil over.
We drove through the area where the shooting and rioting occurred with Lieutenant Latricia Allen of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. She was brought into Ferguson back then to help calm things down. 2 years later, she told me she can make arguments for both sides.
My life as being a law enforcement person and being a mother, because nobody really knows how I feel, but what I do know is that a mother shouldn't have to bury her child, period.
She also says this of Ferguson and its aftermath.
It's the big F word. It's something we don't even really talk about anymore. It's something that occurred, and no one is proud of anything, that happened. It's not like, you're wearing a badge of honor, and, the police officers won, the citizens zero, nothing like that.
Now, Antigone in Ferguson, a theater production, has brought Lieutenant Allen back here again, this time to sing. Performances at the Wellspring Church and Normandy High School, where Michael Brown graduated months before his death, were presented by a New York-based group called Outside the Wire, best known for its so-called theater of war productions aimed at helping military personnel deal with PTSD.
It's about holding a space, creating a space where truths can be told and they can be heard.
Founder Bryan Doerries has expanded the subjects he addresses in his work, but kept the original format.
Because there is nothing shameful in loyalty to a brother.
4 prominent actors present a staged reading of an ancient Greek tragedy.
No woman will ever tell me what to do as long as I live.
A group of experts or HERE community representatives, including a friend of Michael Brown.
What do we do? How do we help?
And his former teacher respond to the issues raised.
So many people look at the actual act of the shooting. People forget about the total blatant disrespect of that boy laying in the ground because people were trying to figure out what to do.
And most important, the audience of community members, people living amid the problem being tackled, engage in a discussion.
We, all over the country, have the same problems here as in everywhere. We are at war with ourselves.
Where do we go as a society when we know what we do is wrong and we continue to do it?
Sometimes that can get heated.
That's the big elephant in the room, that we don't want to talk about the murder rate. We don't want to talk about black-on-black crime because they give us a black eye.
There's no such thing as black-on-black crime. 94% of all crimes committed by black men, are portrayed by other black men. But also, if you read the statistics, it also says that 84% of murders that are committed on white people are committed by white people.
All of them connecting dots between the ancients and their own experience and pain.
We collectively are the Greek chorus, and we speak for what democracy is and for what we want in our world.
I want to move in the direction of Creon.
For Ferguson, Doerries chose Sophocles' tragedy, Antigone.
So the central question of this play, Antigone, is, well, what happens when everyone's right or feels justified in what they're doing? We think about the fact that the protester in the street is right for feeling rage and betrayal and anger, for being devastated by incident after incident after incident that we keep hearing about in the news. And the police force is right to be afraid because we live in this incredibly violent world in which one only has a few milliseconds sometimes to make a decision that could change the rest of your life. And so the play is about stepping back from all that and acknowledging that we're all human, we're all fallible.
Doerries found a local collaborator in Phil Woodmore, a choral teacher at a middle school who also heads singing groups for the St. Louis Police Department and for his church.
I feel that the artistic value of what we're doing breaks down a lot of barriers, it breaks down a lot of walls, and it breaks down a lot of things that put people in boxes where they can be open, they can express themselves freely, and they can give maybe information or share things, personal stories that they might not have shared otherwise.
You have both spoken well.
Yes.
The star power came from 4 actors, Gloria Rubin, Reggie Cathy, Samira Wiley, and Glenn Davis, who'd flown in from various television and other projects, especially for this one day of performances.
Take her away! She has said enough. Bury her alive.
Cathy, known for his work on House of Cards, is a veteran performer of the theater of war.
I wash my hands of her life and death.
This time he played Creon, the king and uncle of Antigone, who in trying to preserve the state is also tearing it apart.
The family killing each other struck me really deeply, I guess because it's only my sister and I've lost both my parents. And that's what we're doing in America. If we're one family, if we truly are e pluribus unum, we're killing each other in a vile way.
These people are doing wrong in the eyes of the gods.
Samira Wiley is a newcomer to this type of performance. She played Antigone and said her current work on Orange is the New Black has a deep connection to events in Ferguson after Michael Brown's death.
You are standing in front of people, you're looking at people who were in this young man's class, people who were his educators. And what we do, at the end of the day is fake. We're acting, but we can elicit real, emotional human feelings from people. And one thing that Bryan Doerries told me was that it's not so much about what we can give them, but what they can give us. Right. And you can hear that in theory, but I really experienced that today.
I'm covered. And that last song, I'm covered, which has multiple meanings of I'm covered in the blood of the Lamb, which of course is Jesus, but sometimes it sounded like they were singing I'm covered in the blood of the land, which strikes you a whole different way. And then you're thinking, oh, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, which is the selfish part of being an actor. That's, you love it, We love killing the people. But it's even better when we all get to take a journey, together. And that happened this afternoon.
That song was written by Phil Woodmore and dedicated to St. Louis law enforcement. Through art, a chance to be heard and perhaps move forward. From Ferguson, Missouri, I'm Jeffrey Brown for the PBS NewsHour.
After an early performance of one of our projects, a general stood up and took on my first question. Why do you think Sophocles wrote this play? What was he trying to say? What was he trying to do? And this general said, I think Sophocles wrote these plays because he was in the minority as a leader with regard to the compassion he felt for the individuals in his community who were struggling with the issues he portrayed in his plays. I think Sophocles wrote these plays, the general said, to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And that's what happens every time we perform these tragedies for audiences who've lived lives of mythological proportions. Those with skin in the game, we're comforted by what brings us together across very disparate human experiences, and that we can have a common reaction to an uncomfortable portrayal of human suffering. And we're afflicted by the reality that there's so much more work to be done in our community and in our country to address the suffering of people to our left and our right, and on the subway on the way home, and in our places of work and our worship, and who may be even sitting to our left and our right, with the screams of these characters inside their heads, though we can't hear them. And it's with that sense of affliction, and I hope comfort, that I'm going to close my remarks with the hope that it leads to at least 10 minutes of fertile discussion. Thank you so much for having me. Someone said there was a mic runner, but I don't mind Phil Donahueing it either. Here you go. Test. I guess they're not on. They were on. Okay, well, first I have to work before we can do anything. Maybe why don't you just say what you're going to say, and I'll repeat it to the group.
Hello, hello.
A brief question.
Yeah.
I never heard the word catharsis.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you deliberately omitted it.
I did.
What's the idea there?
Well, I don't, yeah. Catharsis is one of those, like, it's a word like a library book. It's so abused. It is Greek, but even those in Greece, even Aristotle, don't really give us a very clear definition of what it means. And there have been people who spent careers and then actually generations of careers in the academic world trying to define it. I define it in my book. I try to define it in my book, so you can get the book and get the more. But you know, I don't find it to be useful in the context of talking about my work. In the early days, I thought the work was about catharsis, and I do think it's about purification. One of the songs you heard in that is a chorus, a choir that Phil wrote with his gospel chorus. It's a chorus of Antigone called Purify the City. And when they say purify the city, wash away the unholy pollution, which is Sophocles, not Phil Woodmore or me, and they're in Ferguson, and they're talking about the blood on the streets, and they're talking about the blood in all of our streets, and the purification that we need. Well, I do think Greek drama was a ritual of purification. But in terms of what we're doing, I used to think it was about empathy, and I thought it was about catharsis, and I'd use those words freely. And then I started to see that actually the more constructive and helpful way to talk about it was actually discomfort, shared discomfort. And that what theater can deliver, and tragedy in particular, is a sense of collective discomfort that's so palpable, like that moment where I was describing looking for the exits in the performance, the first performance. So the note that I give actors is, before they go on, is make them wish they'd never come. And if you give a note like that to Paul Giamatti, he will do it. Because he will do something that you will never hear at Lincoln Center. And you'll never hear at the public theater either, because it can't be consumed. It's something that stands outside the boundaries of something you would pay money to hear. It's something that would be inappropriate in an artistic setting. He goes past those boundaries, and in so doing, he pushes us past our boundaries to the moment where I think, I can't take any more of this. I need to leave. And then no matter what divides us, and we have people sitting in our audiences here in New York, in Crown Heights recently, former gang members sitting next to people with Make America Great hats on. No matter what divides us, at least we shared that discomfort for a moment.
I'm just
thinking
of catharsis as the facing of truth.
Sure, that's a good definition. Yeah.
Is a knockout.
Yeah, that's a good definition. And if that's what you and I mean by it, I'll use catharsis. But when other people use it, it often is a kind of almost like a self-help word that it's of very little use to audiences. And it's not, I don't see what we do as an easy fix. I don't see it as therapy. I just see it as a door. We're going to favor the front for a second, but then we'll come back to the back. Yeah, ma'am, please.
After reading the Oresteia,
Yeah.
And then years and years of theater going, I realized that all tragedy begins in the family.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was an enormous insight
It was one of the things that's so remarkable about Greek tragedy is I think it describes things we're only just discovering scientifically now. Right now, there's been all this evidence and writing about what we're now calling epigenetics. The idea that in a single lifetime, your genes can be changed by trauma. Think about how trauma is hard-coded into our bodies and into who we are, and then passed down in a single generation to another generation. And you have all of a sudden what the Greeks called the intergenerational curse or fate as it moves through a family. Now, we can talk about this, but then when we go out next week and perform in East New York, the murder capital of our city, and we're performing in a housing project, for young people who've experienced the death of their friends and family members to gun violence in their community, who've experienced domestic violence, who've experienced addiction, who've experienced gang violence. The idea of a sort of intergenerational curse of violence is as palpable and real to them as their everyday life. And so when I say that the audience with skin in the game has more to teach me than I to teach them, it's an article of faith. And so one of the things that's at the center of our work is what happens when you approach an audience with actual humility for what experience and intelligence is in the room, what new forms are possible of exchange. Because I don't know about you, but when I go to a cultural setting, there's a pretty rigid hierarchy. The artists are bestowing the gift of culture upon the audience. But what if the audience is in the primary position of bestowing the gift? And what are we missing when we silence audiences by plunging them into darkness and acting like they don't exist? Sir, you look like you had something to say. No, well, you don't. You put your hand down, but ma'am, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Oh, thanks. Oh, learning Greek? I didn't teach. I learned Greek from a professor, but yeah, I think. There is no mic, but I will repeat what she says. I promise. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So it's very hard to know what the question is about Euripides and whether by the end of the 5th century Euripides is writing plays that seem like they're anti-war. They also sound like, a lot of them sound like they're critiquing state religion and even the idea of the gods in general. So there's this kind of dissolution of ancient Greek classical Athenian democracy alongside these two major wars, and we're coming to the end of the 5th century, and here's this writer who's kind of undermining it all. And, we use his plays. There's a play called The Madness of Hercules that's our gun violence project. It was born after Sandy Hook, where people said, do you have a play about gun violence? And I said, look, obviously guns didn't exist in the ancient world, but in this play, Hercules wields an invincible weapon, the bow of Apollo. The arrows never miss their targets. And in an act of madness, he turns the weapon upon his own children. And then he wakes up from what he's done and realizes he's killed his family, his wife and his children. And he's visited by his war buddy, Theseus, the guy who fought alongside. Now, because Euripides would have served too. All of these playwrights served. All of the actors were combat veterans. The entire audience was combat veterans, except for the ones that were matriculating into the military. And what does Theseus say when he sees his friend who's killed his own family covering his head and saying that he feels so ashamed and he's afraid he'll stain him with the blood and the pollution of what he's done? Theseus, Hercules, his war buddy, says, you must share the pollution of what you have done with your friends. And Hercules says, I'm afraid that I will stain you with this blood. And he says, soak me in the blood, cover my robes. I will take you to Athens and give you half of my wealth and establish a place for you to live. So we use that play. We have used it with military audiences because, of course, the idea at the center of the play is the idea at the other plays, too, that the purpose of drama in the ancient world is to communalize the pollution of what you have done with your friends. Not, hey, you veteran, you carry the burden of the pollution, the miasma of war on your shoulder by yourself, like we seem to do in our culture, post-Vietnam War. But we will all collectively shoulder the burden of what comes back from these wars together. And by the way, my contention after coming on this long journey 10 years later is that The moral injury is actually the civilian's injury, that we already had the blood on our hands. I marched against the invasion of Iraq in the street right out here on 14th Street in Union Square, but the foreign policy decision was made. In fact, we invaded Iraq on the night my girlfriend died. I thought the whole world was coming to an end. But at the end of the day, acting as if we can isolate ourselves from our country's own foreign policy decisions, even the ones that are being made now, especially the ones that are being made now. The blood's already always on our hands. And so the play does that, and we've been doing it in places that have experienced gun violence. We've been doing it with Cure Violence, which is a anti-violence organization here in New York that treats violence as a public health epidemic and sees no difference between victim and perpetrator, because the victim and the perpetrator have experienced the same cycle of violence. So it raises the question, after all these years of over-incarceration, over-policing, visiting violence and no mental health treatment upon people who've perpetrated violence, how are we ever going to break this cycle unless we as communities go to those who perpetrated violence and say, you must share the pollution of what you have done with your friends? So it's a long answer to your question, but in some ways we have 22 projects, and in some ways they're all the same project. They're all kind of rippling impacts, like concentric circles all rippling out from the same point of impact. Somebody in the back, maybe if we haven't silenced. Yeah, over there, please, yeah. Yeah.
Kind of a theater nerdy question.
Great, I love those.
But when you approached this in the beginning, did you at all look at the theater of the oppressed and the law?
Yeah.
And work with the workers?
Sure, so there's a question, I'll just stay on the mic. There are a number of influences to my work that come before me. One of them is Augusto Boal, Argentinian director of the Theater of the Oppressed, which is they call forum theater, which is this idea of sort of street theater and theater that sort of dissolves the sort of rigid hierarchies of cultural spaces and empowers those, usually the proletariat, people who worked in the front lines, to enact these plays and sort of by virtue of that to be empowered to express their truths and voices. And there's a lot of connection between what I do, at least ideologically, and maybe even politically. However, the biggest difference is I don't wear my politics on my sleeve. Although today I'm, it's the new school, so I'm saying a little bit more but like we didn't get to perform at Gitmo by me coming in, blazing with all of my judgments of Gitmo. Yeah, we had to come in and show some respect. And if people felt we were judging them, so we would, and I think this is instructive to the moment we're living through, because the reason the blood is on our hands with regard to our current political situation is that the left completely alienates the right. And there's a fascism on both sides, and no one's listening to each other. And so with regard to my approach and our approach, like we perform in mega churches. We perform in Ferguson, Missouri. We're going to perform in San Francisco next week and talk about death and dying with Frances McDormand playing Hercules at the Castro Theater, and it's sold out with 1,200 people coming. And then we'll perform in the middle of Kansas, right, for an audience that's 100% Republican. And we'll do that because at the end of the day, we're just talking about plays, and we're doing it because I think what our political moment needs right now, it's not that we need to agree with each other. We just need to spend more time in proximity of each other in a room and listening to each other and being uncomfortable together till someday we can find a way to hear each other and move forward. Yeah, we've lit up the board over here. Maybe, yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I'll just say, just riffing off what you just said, the reason that the reason that Plato's Socrates throws all of the poets out of the ideal republic is because of the very thing that's on display in the discussions that you're seeing after our performances. Short of giving everyone in the room a psychotropic substance, you're not going to get 300 to 1,000 people to open up in the way that we do. And it is a psychotropic experience. I think there are major things that happen inside us when we're touched and penetrated by the theater. And that's dangerous. But I also think it's a tool that we have to use, because if we're going to have the ethical discussion about abortion, or we're going to have an ethical discussion about end of life care, or we're going to have an ethical discussion about war, we have to do it in such a way where actually have in the room at the same time a sense of the suffering and the actual consequences of our ethical decisions. And so if you're looking for a condemnation of war, far more powerful than the sanctimonious left marching in Union Square saying how bad war is, I find, is having those who've been to war or been on the receiving end of war telling their stories. And that's what we learned in the Vietnam era as well. But if you're looking for a celebration of values that no longer exist in our culture except in very rarefied places like loyalty and sacrifice, you can find that in the plays too. And what's, the reason why we can do Antigone with police and Black Lives Matter activists in the same room is because the play doesn't ask you to choose a side. We're not fixing meaning to the play in our model, because we usually interrupt the play and get to the discussion earlier than I did in my talk. Our work is not about fixing meaning, it's about the infinite possibility of interpretation in the room. So when we did Prometheus Bound and Gitmo for the CIA, FBI, the Guards, the Marines, and the JAG lawyers, really controversial things were said on every side of the spectrum. And it didn't matter, no one was punished, because at the end of the day, we were just talking about Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. We probably have time for what, one more or two more, one or two more? Okay, I don't want to, abuse the time we have. Yeah.
This is an academic.
Yeah, okay. Somehow lost my water. Do you know, did someone take it? Oh, there it is. Before I take an academic question, I got to take a drink of water.
I've been taking a lot of classes.
Yeah.
And one of my professors made it very clear that the idea of fatal flaw is really incorrect. It's
Yeah.
really missing the point.
Yes, thank you.
So the whole idea that we're taught this in
I'll repeat it, don't worry.
the whole idea that we're taught this in high school, and then you read something. So
Yeah.
The major questions that would be asked if you weren't focusing on that are
Yeah. No, I'd love to. Yeah. So the question is about the fatal flaw, which is one of the 3 or 4 things we're taught in high school usually about Greek drama. And the word in Greek, hamartano, means to miss the mark. And I don't know about you, but I miss the mark about 1,000 times every day. And that's how I learn. And that's how I get better. And that's then it's what makes us human. It wasn't until the New Testament, until Koine Greek around the time of Christ, came to adopt a moral connotation, and the same word came to mean sin. And then filtered through that lovely filter, we now have this idea that there's a moral fallibility, I think. I mean, that's I'm not a classicist in the sense of, that's the sort of 19th century philology on display right now. I'm sort of making it up. But the idea is, I think that the proper interpretation of what we call fatal flaw, and we learn in our textbooks and cliff notes about Greek tragedy, is actually to miss the mark habitually. My father was a psychologist, one of the last Skinnerian. We had rat labs down the street, and I'd fight with him all the time. This is in my book too, about he believed that by a certain point our all the forces at work upon us that sort of collectively became our fates were so fixed that it would be very hard to make a choice that would deviate in terms of free will beyond and I kept arguing that may be so, but what Greek drama is arguing is that we have this fleeting possibility of making a choice. And so to miss the mark habitually and then to realize too late is sort of what's on display in Greek drama. Creon, but Oedipus too. I mean, Oedipus solves the riddle of the Sphinx, and what's Oedipus's mistake? It's not really hubris or arrogance. It's just a human way. The last strategy that worked, using my intellect, is going to be the thing that I'll use this time that will solve the problem. But what if it's my intuition that's needed this time? Or what if it's listening to someone else openly, rather than thinking that I have all the answers that will solve this next problem? And so that's human. I mean, it can be really, and so Aristotle says, and I think it's right, that in the Poetics, that Greek tragedy isn't about watching perfect people fall, and it's not about watching villains fall, because neither of them really do we derive much from, neither pleasure nor sort of insight. It's watching fallible people with good intentions who aren't psychopaths, who are just doing the best they can as human beings. By virtue, as he says in the Aristotle, this is where we get flaw. Most translators that I like say a certain fallibility. But even that, I think, misses the part about how missing the mark is actually so intrinsically part of what it means to be human and how we actually orient ourselves to the world, how we learn. So anyway, I could talk about the fatal flaw, but that's one of those things that we get a dose of in high school, and then people say, "Is it like catharsis?" Where they, it's like received information, but I think there's an insight in unpacking it a little bit further. That's about as academic as I get. Maybe one last or one more. Whoever's going to get the last, no pressure, but you're going to have the last word. Yeah.
You mentioned some, like, my favorite actors.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, the late great Reggie Cathy. Yeah.
How these people, how do they come to you? They're not going to win Tonys, and I guess that's not particularly remunerative.
Yeah.
So how do they come to you? Are they attracted to your mission, or are they
Sure.
looking for a job?
How do we get actors is the question of this stature to do the work. The short answer is it's very rare in our profession to feel like you're doing something of service with your craft. You can shake hands, you can sign things, you can take pictures, but to feel that the very thing you're saying and the way you're saying it in a room could actually save a life. Now this will sound like hyperbole, but after performances, people line up and they say things like, "This is the first time I spoke to my spouse. This is the first time I'm going to go seek, I saw myself in the character and I'm check myself into a 28-day treatment program the next day. I'm thinking about killing myself." At one event, someone came forward with a plan to kill his friends. If you had told me 15 years ago that ancient Greek drama could save lives, I'd say that's ridiculous. But I think as a culture, we've lost a sense for what theater does or what it can do. And I'll just close, this is my high horse for a second. You asked like a dramatic question. 99% of the time, I think when we go to the cultural world and to the space of the theater, we are moved, we are touched, we're penetrated. It can even be a bad performance, and something changes within us. We kind of come together in a new way. But what do? What are our impulses? And I don't want to blame human beings. Like, we're a risk-averse, conflict-avoidant species for the most part in the civilized world. Like, we're not trying to start trouble with each other. So what do? Well, one of three things. Either some academic, with all due respect, comes out and after the performance and what's called a talk back, which is sort of an infantilizing word if you ask me, says what we're supposed to think about the play, explicates the experience. Or people who share our political beliefs come out and congratulate us for paying money to consume theater. That happens all the time. Or worst of all, and this gets back to your question, we bring out the artists and the actors and we ask them, and the new school is the worst culprit of all, the Actors Studio, the most soul-deadening, banal questions we could possibly come up with, as if we didn't just have a spiritual experience together in the room, and the only thing we really could come together and talk about is how did you memorize your lines, and how did you prepare for this role, and what were you thinking about when you were screaming? And to me, with due respect, I think that's just avoidance on our part as a culture. But we've gotten to the point where we create all this culture and it changes us and it touches us, but then we just leave as if it didn't connect us in some specific way. And our work is about asking the question, what new things are possible when we've been touched? And what conversations can we have that we wouldn't have otherwise? And whose stories are these? Who gets the proprietary right to be talking about them? Those of us who attended Fridays at 1, those of us who studied them in ancient Greek class, or Michael Brown's best friend, the police officer on the front line. Anyway, I'm way over at this point. I'm happy to send books, but it's been a real pleasure being with you today.